Welcome to the Humans Against Poor Scholarship Summer Grant Interviews. Each one of our interviewees is competing for a $2,000 grant to help fund their summer research. Do you want to have a say in who gets funded? Become a HAPS donor today by visiting www.hapsfund.com/donate. Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Digital Hammurabi. This is the second to last HAPS interview stream. Again, my favourite time of the year because I get to talk to PhD students about all the exciting research that they are doing. This weekend, we are talking to archaeology students. So without further ado, I'm going to bring Marta into the stream. Marta, hi.
Hi, I'm fine. How are you?
Yeah, very well, thank you. Before we start talking about your research, could you just introduce yourself, tell everyone who you are, where you are, and what your speciality is?
Yes, so hi everyone. I'm a PhD student at the University of Manchester. I did my BA and MA in Ancient Near East Archaeology in La Sapienza University in Rome. And then I decided to move to Manchester to start my PhD that is about pottery production in southern Mesopotamia during the 3rd millennium BC.
Thank you. And can I ask, what about pottery grabbed your attention? Because I know that for a lot of people, it doesn't seem terribly exciting, and I'd love to get your perspective on that.
Yeah, so I started to get into pottery when I started to go to Iraq. So I've been working in Iraq since 2015 in archaeological excavation led by La Sapienza. And when I went there for the first time, I was able to look at the material in person. So, and then we made analysis, and then we take the x-rays. So I discovered a new word that it was possible to make x-rays of the vessels. So for this reason, pottery grabbed my attention.
So this is probably a good time to ask you about your summer project and what you hope to achieve.
Yeah, so I'll give you some information about my research in general. That is, of course, linked to my summer project. So basically, the purpose of my research is to illuminate the technological choices made by potters in southern Mesopotamia during the 3rd millennium and during the manufacturing process, with the aim of identifying the manufacturing techniques used by potter in the production of distinct vessels' shapes. And the research implies macroscopic analysis, radiographic analysis, and experimental reconstructions. So during these summers, I would like to take the X-rays of some vessels that are in the British museums. So I already made contact with the curators of the Near East sections of the British Museum, and they are supporting my my request that is now with the scientific research department who has to take the last decisions. So I'm very confident that we'll accept my my applications, because the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford has already accepted my request to take the X-rays. But if in any for any reasons the British Museum will reject my my request, I'll use this funding to cover the expenses that I will need to do in the US, because within May and June I will go to the Oriental Institute in Chicago and the Penn Museums in Philadelphia to see pottery assemblages from some southern Mesopotamian sites.
Thank you. So how exactly do you go about X-raying pottery? Do you have to take it to a medical institution? Are there special X-ray machines that stay in archaeological research centers? What do you have to do?
So basically, when we are in Iraq, we use the medical facilities. So we went to Nasiriyah, the city where we usually take the X-rays, and we asked to the doctor to take the X-rays. But of course, here the situation is different because the museum has the technicians to take the X-rays. So they have specific facilities in the museums to take the X-rays.
That's fantastic. And what kind of information can you get when you take X-rays of pottery?
Yeah, so if you can show the other pictures though of the jar, I think it's more explicative, so it helps me. Basically, so the has my project aims to understand the manufacturing techniques. The X-rays, the observation of the X-rays help us to distinguish one manufacturing techniques from the others through the observation of the hair voids or the inclusions. To be honest, is easy when it's similar to the an X-rays of our skeletons or of a bone. So if I break my arm, I need an X-rays to see the damage, the which kind of fracture I have, and it's the same with the X-rays. So, for example, in this chart, we can see that the characteristic of the base are different from the upper body, and this means that it was made in two different techniques and two different stages and then attached together. Sometimes, well, of course, we cannot see these from the macroscopic analysis. So, and then sometimes the surface of the vessel have been smoothed or scraped to refine the surface, and then these secondary techniques have obliterated the primary manufacturing techniques, but this not happen looking at the X-rays.
What kind of manufacturing techniques did ancient societies use to make vessels like this?
So they use handmade techniques like pinching, so lifting up the clay with the fingers, or the coils. So these sausages of clays put one above the others, or maybe a mold, or the wheel. So they use a wheel thrown technique to make the vessels.
And when you look at these X-rays and you better understand the manufacturing techniques and really how they were made, what kind of information does that allow you to maybe better understand about the cultures and the people who made them?
So yeah, maybe. So we don't know. We know few information about the manufacturing techniques so far. So we, through understanding the manufacturing techniques, of course, we can understand the skills of the potters, which kind of techniques they were able to use. So, to what extent they were able to use the wheel, there was more complicated techniques than making the vessels through handmade techniques. And how maybe they will be able to mix or intertwine the different techniques within each other.
Thank you. And sorry,
Sorry.
you carry on.
And then, so also can help to see how the techniques developed through to the periods. So, for example, I'm studying the early dynastic and Akkadian period. So analyzing these kind of vessels, see if there is any differences throughout these periods. So if there is any changes in the manufacturing production.
That was my next question actually, do you get significant changes in manufacturing methods through time period or geographical location?
So there are some information about the vessels of the early dynastic, the beginning of the early dynastic period, that they use more handmade technique instead. The hand of the early dynastic, more use of the wheel. But of course, I cannot say now if I'm sure of what is affirmation, because I just started the analysis, so I cannot say something for sure. Of course, there will be some changes throughout the history and the periods. Of course, the invention of the wheel and the rise of the wheel changed the manufacturing process, but I don't know how fast, and I don't know now how fast these changes could have been.
Great, thank you. We have a question from the audience. Is there a difference in the manufacturing technique for daily use pottery and the technique used for vessels made for ritual purposes?
Oh, very good questions. So when I excavated in Iraq, so from the typological point of view, we find more or less the same shapes in the domestic activities and the funerary context, for example. So we have bowls and beakers, both in domestic context and in funerary context. But we saw that maybe the funerary vessels or the vessels found in funerary context seems better made or refined than the domestic activities. But because I'm at the beginning of the research, of course I will take in considerations to make this difference of the context of the vessels that I've analyzed to see if there are any pattern, any differences according to the context.
And with the corpus you're working with, do you have an awful lot of materials that are found in good archaeological contexts, or do you have primarily things that have been thrown away or deposited in places that don't really have a lot to do with the purpose they were made for?
Yeah, some majority of the potters belong also to close context, like the funerary context, so in graves. So they'll be better preserved than in domestics or in dump context, for example. So I have both sides, so both contexts. So just close contact, more easy to understand, to give a chronology, but also some in context that we are not sure the period or if it's reliable for the chronology.
Thank you. We have another audience question asking, can anybody in ancient Mesopotamia make pottery, or is it reserved for a particular class of person, or maybe it's like a family trade?
Okay, this is another good questions, because if we think about metal workers or textiles worker, we have more information in the ancient documents. Instead, we have few information about potters. And maybe it could be several reasons, maybe because if we think about metal or stones or textile, they were more expensive than pottery, that it could be also an utilitarian object. So it would be also interesting to see, understand why we don't have many references of the potters. We know sometimes in the later periods we have more informations of potters, and we have some potters that were part-time. So for half part of the year they work in the fields, but then they work as a potters, or they semi-attached to the institutions or independent specialists. So it's not clear the situation of the potters for the period that I studied.
And I know this is tricky with the variations over time periods, but do we have a lot of evidence for where pottery production was carried out? Is this something that happens in domestic spaces? Are there separate like pottery manufacturing workshops? How did things work for that?
So there are some in some archaeological sites. There are it's been found some kilns to fire the pottery that they're usually at the edge of the sites, because of lots of smoke while firing them. But yes, there are specific, it could be domestic, but also specific workshops related to the pottery productions.
Thank you. And what kinds of decorative techniques do you see on this kind of early style pottery?
Decorative. So my period doesn't use any paintings, but we have some incised decorations, so geometric decorations, maybe use of a wooden object to make incised decoration or combat decorations, or yes, but mainly this kind of simple decorations.
And do you see, I'm going a little bit further afield, so if this is beyond your scope, please don't hesitate to tell me. Do you see motifs, decorative motifs being carried across from pottery to other manufactured goods, or is pottery decoration a very distinct, specific style?
I think, I mean, for the incisions, maybe it would be maybe a more common for pottery. Maybe paintings could be similar, but I can't say this for sure, of course, just because I'm focused on pottery.
Thank you very much. And a little bit on the practicality of the X-rays that you're taking. Is it difficult to get permission to do this kind of study with ancient materials?
So it's important to say that the X-rays are not invasive, not destructive, so they don't damage the vessels. So it's easy to make them. If the museum has the facilities to make them, it's easy. And also the museums take the X-rays for their own purpose, so it's not easy to get access. And also it's important that they don't damage the vessel, so they can reuse to other analyses. And of course, these X-rays can be included in the online database and shared with research communities, but also with the audience, so with the public, the museums, with the visitors of the museums.
And have you found generally museums are quite open to making these images for you?
Yes, I think so. For example, the Ashmolean museums promptly accepted my application, so they just give me the date. So they will take the X-rays the 12th of June, and to help them. So I sent, of course, when I went to Oxford to see the vessels in person. I analyzed 70 vessels, but I understood that it's not possible to make 70 X-rays. So I selected just the main typologies, or the more significant for my research. So I selected 22 vessels to X-rays, and then so they were happy that I make these selections, and I'll also give them a priority. So because I thought it was not possible to make all the 22 vessels X-rays, I gave them a priority, so top priority, medium, and low. But then they said, oh no, it's fine, we can take the X-rays of the 22 vessels.
How many vessels total are you hoping to get X-rays for?
So 22 vessels and the Ashmolean Museum, other 25 or 20 at the British Museums. And then when I'll be in Chicago and Philadelphia, whole Husk, it would be possible to take the X-rays also of that museums. But overall, maybe 80, but 100 with mine, the X-rays of Abu Tbera's X-rays.
Thank you. And these vessels, you mentioned typologies and choosing vessels based on the typologies that you have. Could you just very briefly explain what a vessel typology is and maybe the types of vessels that you're working with?
Yes, so basically the typology is the shape. So just basically speaking, the shape of the topologies. So it could be a jar or a bowl. So to explain the profile of the vessel. So I selected jars, trays, bowls, and beakers.
Sorry, this one here is a beaker, yes?
Yes, it's a beaker, and the other one is a jar. It could be maybe different. So the jar could be convex base, or with a ring base, or with a pedestal. Could be with the ridges on the shoulders. So there are some features that may varies, but then the topology itself would be jars, bowls, and beakers. Then some subcategories of the typologies.
And do you find that there are many more of one particular type of vessel than another, or are they all relatively common?
I mean, we have many bowls and beakers that they represent the majorities of the vessel that we have. But there are, of course, many jars as well that may vary from convex base, rounded base, but I can see that bowls and beakers are the main typologies.
And do you have a sense for whether this is because there were just more bowls and beakers made in antiquity, or is this because they were used for purposes that meant that they were far less likely to be broken than maybe some other types of vessel?
Oh yeah, I think there should be also the purpose or the uses that we made with these vessels. Of course, bowls and beakers were more utilitarians and used both in the funerary context, but also domestic activities. They could be also drinking vessels. So I think we to understand why one typology is more widespread than another would be also the use that they made with these kind of typologies, and also were easy to make. So if a potter has to produce many vessels, it was more quick to make bowls and beakers than making a jar.
And you mentioned with the beaker, I'm going to get that actually back on the screen. You mentioned for the beaker that there were, it was made in, not the beaker, the jar, it was made in two different parts. Is it, how often do you see in the X-rays vessels made in different sections and then put together
So for
versus
the
eaten as one piece?
for the bowls and beakers, probably made just by just one part. Instead, in this situation, so we can see the difference. So the base, the upper body, and then the neck and the rim. So three different parts. And then with the jars, it's more common this kind of techniques. But I'm studying for this, so this is the situation in Abu Bara. So for this reason, I asked the museums to have the X-rays of their material, because I can see if it's just something that I see in Abu Bara or is something shared with other archaeological sites.
I see. So you're investigating whether manufacturing differences exist,
Yes.
geographically speaking. That's fascinating. Thank you. I'm done with my questions, and we don't have any more from the audience. Was there anything you wanted to add before I let you go?
I mean, it's fine. I mean, I'm the first stage of the experimental replicas. So in other things, I'll make the replicas of the ancient vessels. So I'm working with a potter to replicate the vessels. So I have hypotheses from the radiographic analysis and from the macroscopic analysis, and I will try to corroborating all hypotheses through the replicas of the vessels. And of course, at the end, we will take the X-rays also of these reproductions. So we'll compare the X-rays of the ancient replicas with the X-rays of my reproductions and see if there is any similarities or differences.
That's fascinating. So when when you're doing this kind of experimental archaeology and reproducing ancient forms, how far do you go to mimic the manufacturing techniques? Do you use a modern kiln? Do you use modern clay? Or do you try and have the material and the process match as closely as possible to what ancient potters would be doing?
So now with the potter, we are using slow wheel. So usually now the potter use the kick wheel. So with the moving the wheel with the foot. But now to be more, I don't know, close to the reality, even though we're not sure, we are using the slow wheel. So the potter use one hand to move the wheel to replicate the vessels. And so the experiments are for these because we don't know the reality, so we'll make as much replicas as we can, and then we will see if there are similarities.
That's fantastic. Thank you. And do you, when you're again doing this kind of process, do you get to like make your own replicas yourself, or do you leave the manufacturing just to the potter?
So yeah, I made some replicas just to better understand his movements, because I take notes. I make videos of the potters, but to better understand the movement of the hands, for example, and how it affects the clay, I made some vessel by myself. Of course, I am an unskilled potter and just an assistant.
That's very cool. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I am done. Thank you so much for coming and telling us about your research, Marta. It's been really interesting.
Thank you very much for having me here.
Of course, and I'll be in touch at the end of the month to let everyone know what happens next.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank
Goodbye.
you. Bye. That was Marta. She is working on ancient pottery from the early dynastic period in Mesopotamia, taking x-rays of museum collections and getting her hands dirty and making her own pottery, which is super cool. I love it when people are able to do that kind of thing. We are going to take the briefest of breaks. We should have our next interviewee coming in about 5 minutes time. So I'm going to put the holding screen up, go and grab a glass of water, and I will be right back. Please don't go anywhere. We've got more exciting archaeology coming. Hi everyone, I'm back. I don't know what has happened to our next guest, so while we wait for her, I'm just going to be here. I'm going to be answering questions if anyone has questions, chatting, enjoying myself. I have a cup of tea. It's very exciting. It is red raspberry leaf with some honey because it's very tasty, and I am trying to get off my English breakfast tea. Addiction may be too strong a word, but I drink a lot of breakfast tea, so we're broadening our horizons and enjoying a mug left to me by my grandmother. It's a very nice mug. I'm a fan of it. So if you have questions for me about Digital Hammurabi, about HAPS, about Mesopotamia in general, what on earth I've been doing with my life, why we don't have interviews so often anymore, I'm here. Go for it. I'm ready to chat. I should probably talk about a little bit about what we have coming up. So after the interviews this weekend, these are our last HAPS interviews. After these, I will be emailing all donors. So if you are a HAPS donor, look in your email inbox. Early next week, I will be contacting you with information on how to vote for the research you want to see your money funding. If you aren't a HAPS donor and you're not entirely sure who we are or what we're doing at the moment, HAPS is Humans Against Poor Scholarship. It is a nonprofit that I run. There's information in the description, and there's a link across the bottom of your screen if you want to go and have a read through of what we do. We provide summer research funding for PhD students who are working on some aspect of the ancient Near East. That includes Egyptology, Hebrew Bible, Near Eastern archaeology, and Assyriology. We also get students who are working, for example, in the classics or in Persian studies, who have some kind of intersection with the ancient Near East. So a couple of weeks ago, I did speak to a classicist who is working on interactions between, I think, Minoan or Mycenaean Greece and Egypt. Fascinating, because it includes Egypt. He's absolutely eligible to apply for HAPS. We don't put any strings on the money. If you are a current PhD student and you need financing and you work in some aspect of the ancient Near East, then you can apply. People don't have to spend money and then submit receipts to get the grants. We just send them. I say we don't have any strings. We have one string. You have to do an interview. You have to do an interview before funding is awarded. If you get funding, you go, you do your research, you get it's what 75%, so $1,500 upfront. You go, you do your research, and then we send the second $500 after you come back on and do kind of like a debrief interview. Let everyone know how your research went, what you did in the summer, if you were able to do the thing that you spoke about doing, and your next plans moving forward. That's the only string. People can use the money for travel expenses. They can use the money for accessing museum archives, for attending conferences, for paying their rent while they are writing up their dissertation, for paying for childcare so they can actually sit and write without having small children attack them. I mean, attack is, again, a bit of a strong word, but you saw my son wandering in earlier. It's very difficult to work with small children running around because they want to play. So having childcare is incredibly helpful. So that's one of the things that you can use your funding for that. Absolutely not a problem. And the way that we choose who gets funding is kind of like a Britain's Got Talent, Dancing with the Stars type voting system. Donors donate as little as $1 is perfectly reasonable and gets you a vote. And then after all of the interviews take place, I set up the voting system, and I send out emails to all of the donors with a link so that they can vote for the students, the research that they want to see funded. So people get to have a real say in where their money goes and the research that gets further development. So yeah, it's fun. It's a little odd, but it's fun. And I really hope that it helps to create, give people a stake in research, because I think that's something that academia is very bad at, both making research relevant to non-academics, which is part of why we insist on live interviews with non-specialists, but also showing people why it matters and giving people a stake and a say and some kind of investment in what's going on in terms of research. So that's what we're trying to do. I don't know if we're successful, but it's a lot of fun. And I like to think we help some people, and audiences always seem at least mildly interested in what we're doing. As far as I am concerned, I have a whole lists and lists of plans of stuff that I want to do with the channel and outside the channel. It's a little difficult to find the time, but I am working on it. I'm so close. I'm about this far from finishing the second volume of the Sumerian grammar book, or the Sumerian grammar series. Book 2 is so close to being done. I have to finish a couple of the appendices. We're waiting on some illustrations by the amazing Dan McClellan. If you don't know Dan McClellan, he's a biblicist, very active on TikTok and Twitter, and has a podcast now called Data Over Dogma, which I must confess I haven't listened to, but I am sure is fascinating. He had Dr. Francesca Stavrokopoulou on, I think, as his first guest. He's a prior student of hers, so I'm sure that was fascinating. But he's also a very good artist, and he's very kindly doing some illustrations for us. So there will be tablets in there drawn by Dan, which is great because it means I don't have to do them, and he's much better than I am anyway. So that is nearly finished. Josh is finishing up the second edition of his Did the Old Testament Endorse Slavery? And I don't think we have a copy of the first edition. The first edition was excellent, very thorough. The second edition, he's doubled the page count. And there is an awful lot more information. There's a lot more direct comparisons between the ancient Near East and the Hebrew Bible. He brings in a lot of ancient slave laws outside of the Hebrew Bible so that people can, I think, better understand a more holistic, or have a more holistic understanding of slavery in the ancient Near East. And also there's a much more extensive section on slavery in the antebellum period and how that relates to slavery in the Hebrew Bible. And I think he goes into slavery in early Christianity as well, but don't quote me on that because I have not read it yet. He is finishing it up, and then he's doing his last read through now, and then I'm going to read it myself and make any edits that need making. And hopefully we're going to ask Seth if he would read it for us for the audiobook. Hopefully. It's quite long, and I don't want to twist his arm because that's a lot of work. So we'll see. But that is in progress and should be available. Josh wants it out by the autumn. So that gives the summer for him to finish it, for me to go through, make my edits, and then hopefully get it over to Seth or whoever else is going to narrate it. So it will be here, fingers crossed, by the autumn, as well as the slavery grammar book, the Sumerian grammar book. So that's exciting. What else is going on? I'm teaching Sumerian, actually, in a couple of weeks. Sorry, my mic. There we go. I'm teaching Sumerian in a couple of weeks at Peninsula College. It will be an online course, only 6 weeks. It's a 2-part course, so 6 weeks for one part, and then as long as we get the registration numbers, 6 weeks for the second part. We'll be working through pretty much the information is found in Learn to Read Ancient Sumerian, an instruction for complete beginners. So if you have that book and you've read it, you're not necessarily going to get new information. So don't feel like you're missing out. But if you are someone who learns better with an instructor guiding you and helping you and giving you feedback in the moment, then that is something that you might want to look at. I'll put a link in the description while I remember. And I'm also looking at making it's not going to be like you can't use it for credit towards an undergraduate degree, but it will hopefully have a continuing education credits. I'm not entirely sure I fully understand what that is, but it does mean you can put it on a university transcript. You can put it on a CV. I think it counts as the equivalent of a high school class. I'm not sure, but there is an option if you're interested in getting some kind of official certification that you have taken a Sumerian class, which you may or may not want, but it's going to be fun. I haven't taught in donkey's years. So I still know how to do it. I'm very excited. There are, I think, 11 people signed up already, which is very exciting. So yeah, that will be enjoyable. What else is going on? You probably know, I'm hosting the Misquoting Jesus podcast with Dr. Bart Ehrman, which is fun and very intensely educational for me because I do a load of research before we go on. Aha, we have Tiffany. All right, I'm going to stop waffling and bring Tiffany in. Tiffany, hi.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me here today.
Absolutely. Could you please give a brief introduction, who you are, where you are, and what your specialization is?
Yeah, so I am a PhD candidate at Ariel University in Israel, and I am studying the archaeology of the southern Levant in the Iron Age, and my specialty is zooarchaeology and specifically butchery marks, and even more specific than that is chop marks.
So can you tell us what butchery marks are and then what chop marks are?
Yeah, for sure. So butchery marks are the marks left behind on the animal bones or the faunal remains by the tools that were used to process the carcass. So you can see knife marks, which are slice marks, which are usually really thin. Chop marks are usually used for like larger, dismemberment. If you got to divide it up, and you usually use an axe for that. And then you also could have things like percussion marks, so things like hammer stones, if you're trying to get into the marrow of the bone. So you have different types of marks and different tools that could make those marks.
And what kinds of conclusions can you draw from these different marks on the bones you're looking at?
So what I usually look at is like cultural butchering practices, like how is this actually done? And what were the choices that people made to process their food? Because it's not just the ingredients they use for food, but it's also how you choose to process them, right? But then there's also it's a question of technology as well. So what's available to you? Do you use stone tools? What type of stone? Do you use metal? What type of metal?
So what? Are you restricting your study to a specific animal, a specific location, or just southern Levant animal bones with chop marks generally to see what patterns you can discern from that information?
Yeah, so I am looking at something fairly specific. So I'm looking at the food processing traditions and the butchering techniques of the Iron Age Philistines and Judahites during the Iron Age 2A and B.
Can you tell us what the differences between 2A and 2B for those who are not familiar with Levantine chronology?
Yes, of course. So Iron Age 2A is really the height of the Philistine development. And one of the sites that I'm specifically looking at, the site Philistine Gath, so Tel Asafi Gat, during the Iron 2A, it's the largest of the Philistine cities, and it's really successful. And after the Iron 2A, so in the late 9th century, Philistine Gat was actually destroyed by Hazael, and it never recovered. So the city never actually recovered. And then it seems to have become a smaller Judahite settlement. And the site that I'm going to be comparing Philistine Gat with is Tel Burna, which is actually only about 8 kilometers away. So it's not very far, but you have really different material culture. And it's very clearly a Judahite site. And it runs all the way through the Iron 2A and Iron 2B. So it'll be a great comparison of those sites.
And are you expecting to find significant differences in butchery practices between the two sites?
That I'm not sure of.
I'm sorry, I'm aware that a lot of these questions are really difficult to answer when you're kind of before you've finished your research project.
I mean, it would be really interesting to find, like completely different practices. But to be honest, I'm not expecting it to be like completely different, mainly because butchery, although it's although it's still a cultural and a social task, it's also a functional task, right? Like you're doing it for a specific purpose, and certain animals are usually divided in certain ways just because of where the meat is. But you can definitely find small differences, and the differences I'm more expecting maybe to find are portion preference, so maybe cut preference. So where are these chop marks located on the body? Are cuts of meat specific to this specific group? Do they prefer this cut, or does this group prefer a different cut? And then also types of materials. So, I mean, in the Iron Age, this is the beginning of iron, right? Iron is starting to come on the scene, but not all communities accept new technologies and new materials at the same rate, right? Adoption processes vary for different reasons. And so I am expecting to see differences in tool material preference.
How
But we
easy
will
is
see.
it? How easy is it to tell what tools we use? You said that like the cut marks, you can identify this is a knife, this is a hammerstone. When you get down to that level of specificity, how easy is it to tell, okay, this is a particular kind of stone, this is like obsidian or I don't know, basalt or something, and this is iron versus bronze?
Yeah, so that is the challenge. So with slice marks, different analyses on slice marks and experimental work has been going on for 40, maybe not quite 50 years, but 30, 40 years. And there's a vast literature on this. People dedicate their lives to it and some really amazing research. But when I actually was in my MA and was introduced to butchery analysis through my advisor, I actually came to him with some chop marks with these same questions, being like, okay, you're the expert on slice marks. Tell me how we can figure out what materials made these chop marks. And he was like, I'm not really sure. You need to look into it. So I started researching this, and I was actually really shocked that there's very little research done on chop marks. There's been very little experimental work. Even like definitions and terminologies were unclear on even how to describe these marks. So I actually did an experimental study with different types of axes as my goal to try to kind of clear some of this up and see if we could tell differences. In my previous experimental work, I was really because I was working in the early Bronze Age, I was really looking at the difference between stone and metal axes. And so I did tests with multiple axes and multiple types of bones. And very generally, and in a broad sense, there are definitely differences. But now that I'm working in the Iron Age, and I mean, you're really not seeing a lot of stone tools, you are getting down to like which types of metals are used. So really what I'm going to do to attempt to achieve this is more experimental work. And I'm going to work with a copper axe, a bronze axe, and an iron axe. And we're going to do experiments and using fracture pattern analysis and fractography. We're going to try to see if we can find some morphological differences to try to determine these materials.
Amazing. Thank you. And I have to say, someone left a comment before the stream even started saying, I think, tongue in cheek, is archaeology even a science? And if you can listen to this conversation and come away with the feeling that actually archaeology is not scientific at all, then I suggest you replay it, because this is exactly what scientific experimentation is. What then are your summer plans? Is this your summer research?
Yes, this is definitely my summer research. Actually, I have a very busy summer. So hopefully starting next month even, I'm going to be starting with the experimental impact study part of the project. And then June and July, I'm actually excavating at Tel Bernau, which is one of my sites. So I excavate there, I get to work there, and it's an amazing site. And then for the rest of the summer, once again, back to the impact project. And then at the very end of the summer, at the end of August, I'm actually presenting at a conference in Belfast, and they have quite a few sessions on experimental archaeology. So I'm really excited to be a part of this, not only to present, but I also really want feedback on like my experimental method and techniques and what I'm doing, because experimental archaeology, even though it's popular, it's still a small community. And so, yeah, I'm excited to get some feedback from that.
When you're doing this kind of experimental work, how much data do you try and gather? Like, how many chop marks do you inflict using specific implements so you feel like you've got enough data to draw some kind of conclusion from?
Yeah, so it's always a bit of a hard line between having enough data and also having too much data. I don't mean too much data. I mean, not having time to analyze all the data. That's what I mean. So my original goals for this was 360 individual impacts. I think that may have been a little too ambitious when I first proposed that. It's because we have 4 different axes we're testing. We need to test them on multiple types of bone because not all bones are the same. Like, bones are different densities, they're different structures. You can't really expect that a bronze chop mark is going to look the exact same on an adult cow femur as an infant sheep rib. Like, they're not going to be the same because those bones are different structures. And with impacts, it's not just the material impacting the bone, it's also how the bone reacts to the impact. So there has to be a lot of testing that is done, and we're going to test at least 5 types of bones and 4 axes at different angles and with 2 different forces. So it's going to be quite a bit. We're going to have quite a bit of data.
How do you measure things like, or when you're doing this experimentation, how do you make sure you've got the right angle or you've got the right force so that it's comparable data across the board?
Yeah, definitely. That's very important. So I'm so thankful that where I am actually it's called an Instron, I can't remember the number, the Instron impact machine. This machine is probably 6 feet tall. It's an enclosed machine, and we're actually going to attach the axes to the impactor, and we're actually getting a specific stand for the bones made from the company, which is very expensive. But so and that's going to we're going to be able to manipulate the bone into the position that we want the impact to hit on.
That's fantastic. So it's not you just kind of standing out in a field somewhere with a bunch of axes.
Actually, my first project was, and it was actually really fun. But yes, as experimental work progresses, you're like, okay, I need to control these variables. And so I'm very lucky that I have access to this drop tower system because
that's very awesome.
They're not widely available.
I believe that. We have a question from the audience. Do the cuts in the bone leave any traces of metal that could be analyzed by spectroscopy?
So I have thought about this. I've never actually tested any of the either archaeological or experimental chop marks for this. But I have played around with this thought. I kind of don't think so, but like I said, I actually haven't looked into it to be able to answer that question with 100% certainty. And also the archaeological bones, they go through we often wash them multiple times, especially with butchery marks, because they really have to be clean when we see them. So we often give them a really good scrub just so that we can see the detail. So that's why I'm kind of iffy on that. It might not be there.
No, that makes sense. We have a super chat just dropped by to say thanks for promoting scholarship and expertise. I appreciate the knowledge you share with anyone for free. Thank you very much for that. I really appreciate the thought, and I love being able to do this. So it's absolutely my pleasure. How did you get into archaeology, but then this very specific branch of zooarchaeology?
Yeah, so I always knew I wanted to go into archaeology, and I was exposed to zooarchaeology pretty early on in my undergraduate degree. I was in a department that was really bone heavy, so I got to take courses like zooarchaeology, osteology. I often volunteered in the bone lab, and so I was just really exposed to it, and luckily I liked it. It would have been bad if I didn't. And then so for my MA, I knew that I wanted to do zoo archaeology, and I knew I wanted to work in the Middle East. So I sought out an advisor that I thought would work really well. And luckily it worked out really well for me. And that my MA advisor is actually a slice mark specialist. So he introduced me to all these ideas. And actually, it was actually a passing comment from him that spurred my interest in chop marks. So I was analyzing my first large faunal collection. He's sitting there with me, making sure I do all my IDs right and telling me how to do it. And he was pointing out all these chop marks, saying, "Oh, look at all these chop marks here." And he said, if I didn't know this collection was early Bronze Age, I would swear these were made by metal axes. And that's when I really thought that was really fascinating, and I really wanted to look into it more. And when I discovered there's kind of a research void in that area. So yeah, it was really through my advisor.
What so you mentioned that you've done this kind of experimental work before for your MA. What kinds of patterns and conclusions did you see and conclusions did you manage to draw from that study?
So for my first experimental study, I tested, I tested 5 axes. I tested 2 chipped stone axes, a ground stone axe head, a copper, and a bronze axe. And I really found the chipped stone axes weren't really suitable for chopping bone, mainly because a chipped stone axe, you have to chip it fairly fine to get a sharp point. We call it the cutting bit. And so if you hit it at exactly the right angle, it can cut the bone. But if you hit it at even a slight angle that the lithic doesn't like, it snaps. And so I found I got a couple chops out of them, and then the tool was kind of rendered useless. And if you're not a napper, you can't just go in and fix that, right? Like I had a napper make them for me. So, I mean, maybe for ancient people, you go back and fix it. But I found that tool not so great for chopping. The ground stone axe could definitely chop bone. I mean, these are pretty heavy axes, right? They have the weight behind them. But similarly to the chipped stone, the ground stone axe, even though it's not quite as fragile, that sharp bit really chips off quite quickly, just like little bits chip away, and it becomes rounded and dulled. And so you really see a lot more crushing in the bone. You see a lot more fragmentation of the bone. I had one bone that ended up as like, a bunch of little pieces. So you're seeing just like heavy fragmentation of these. And then with the metal axes, these were actually axes that could actually start cutting through the bone with less fragmentation. But that was also kind of on a spectrum, of course, and even on a spectrum with the metal axes. The copper, once again, is a very soft metal, so it dulled very quickly. You lose that edge, it kind of rounds over. And once again, you see more crushing and less actually cutting through the bone, so more fragmentation. Less fragmentation than the other ones, but still a bit of fragmentation. When you're getting into the bronze axe, you are seeing a lot more cutting capabilities, mainly because of the structural integrity of the material itself. It can hold that edge, and it can hold up to the impact that you're putting it through. So you're seeing a lot cleaner of chop marks, really cutting through that bone, creating what basically the only definition I could ever find in the textbooks of like a textbook chop. But once again, also, it didn't create it every time. It really depended on the angle. If it only would create this when you cut it at a 45-degree angle. If you hit the bone at a 90-degree angle, you're more likely to see a very clean fragmentation hit and kind of break. Not that it would fragment everywhere, but a clean break. And a break is very different than a cut. So we definitely saw differences in these axes, but that those differences spurred more questions that once again need to be tested and variables need to be isolated.
Do you see these patterns of difference in the ancient remains that you study, or not so much?
Yes, and a little bit no. So especially with my previous work, so there's definitely a clear bias here, is that stone chop marks are very hard to recognize in faunal assemblages. Breakage, it can look like depositional breakage, especially if you're not really, really careful on looking at every broken edge, looking for a little bit of crushing along the lines and things like that can be easily mistaken for depositional damage. So you're definitely going to see a bias for seeing metal chop marks. But once again, if they're not metal, if metal isn't being used on the assemblage, metal axes, you're not going to see that at all. So I'd say there's a problem in recognizing chop marks that aren't made by strong metal axes, basically.
I see. So if you have a collection of bones and it looks like some of them have been broken just from being thrown into a pit and then covered over again, some of them might be breaks, but some of them could also be chop marks from different materials.
Yeah, and right now we just don't have the methods to recognize that yet. Hopefully that will be coming, but we don't have the methods to recognize that yet. That's really gonna take looking at fracture pattern analysis, which is a method used in forensic anthropology a lot. Really analyzing fracture lines, fracture patterns, seeing how the bone breaks, the branching patterns. That's research that definitely needs to be done.
And when you're looking at butchery marks, butchering is typically performed on animals that are still covered in meat. Does this impact how the cut marks look on the bones versus just cutting bare bone?
So with dismemberment marks, so actually no, it doesn't. You would think that it would, but it doesn't really seem to affect the marks themselves. Because meat is a soft material, basically the impact that it's going to have on the bone is really due to the shape and the texture of the material itself. So if it's getting through the meat to the bone, the meat doesn't really have that much of an effect on it. And there was actually one experimental study on that I could find. So no, they didn't find much difference. And so the bones that I'm going to be testing actually won't have meat on them. I'm actually going to deflesh the bones. In my first study, I actually left the meat on because I was concerned about that too. But what I really found was that it made aiming at the exact part of the bone you want very difficult. And you couldn't really tell exactly where your mark was hitting until you defleshed it and cleaned the bone up. And then, if it hits a different part of the bone, they might not be exactly comparable. So I think it's more important to know exactly on the bone where you're hitting.
That is really interesting and absolutely not the answer I was expecting. Thank you. And definitely I can see that being a real challenge if you're trying to be precise with, I need this area of bone at this angle. Having something in the way is going to be an issue, and then you can't check it until you finished.
No, you really can't check it, and you also can't hit it again, because if you have overlapping marks, you could just crush your other mark. You don't know which mark affected which, and so you can't really do that. So you kind of get one shot at each bone, and also you have to buy all of these bones, so you do want to be careful.
You need to conserve your resources as best you can.
Definitely, yes. Experimental archaeology is actually surprisingly expensive.
We have another question. Are the bones that you're looking at mainly sheep and goat, or are there any other common animals present as well?
So the majority of the sample, like the archaeological samples that I look at, are sheep and goat. There's lots of cow actually in the assemblages that I'm looking at as well. There might be little bits of pig, but you're not seeing that. Maybe a few wild species, maybe a few wild deer species, maybe some wild bird in there as well, but you're not really seeing the chop marks on those types of bones. You're really seeing it on the bigger bones. So it is mainly sheep and goat and cow. And those are mainly the bones that I'm going to be testing as well to make it comparable.
Awesome, thank you. I don't have any more questions for you. This has been really fascinating. I have zero background in zooarchaeology. I have a friend who's a zooarchaeologist, but we don't talk shop so much when we see each other.
That's fair. I get that.
Is there anything that you wanted to share, anything you wanted to talk about before I let you go that we haven't touched on yet?
Sure. Well, I think I kind of mentioned this, but I wanted to let everyone know that, the funding from the HAPS scholarship would go directly to supplies and equipment for the project, to purchase the bones, to purchase the stand, the underneath stand of the drop tower machine. Oh, and also the axes. So I've acquired most of the axes, but one axe still needs to be made. I have a blacksmith who's going to actually create a replica iron axe for me. So that's
actually
where
a
the
really
funding
good
would be
point.
going.
How do you go about finding someone to make these replicas for you? Because that's a really specialized skill, I think.
Yes, it is. It really is. But surprisingly, there are actually quite a few people who really enjoy doing this. And I mean, the internet is a wonderful resource, right? But you do need them kind of specific to your region and kind of the type of axe that you are using. So luckily, I was able to find a few basically artisans who created these tools for me, and they were special orders. And they were very kind, very accommodating. But yes, iron reproduction is not as common as bronze and copper reproduction. So that's why, yeah, I'm getting a blacksmith to do it for me, a friend of a friend.
Oh, perfect. Word of mouth.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Tiffany, so much for coming and talking about your research. It was an absolute delight, and I appreciate you making the time on a Saturday afternoon.
Of course. Yes, thank you so much.
Oh, gosh, you're welcome. I will be in touch at the end of the month with information about what happens next. So thank you again and have a lovely day.
Okay, great. Bye.
Bye. That was Tiffany. She is a zooarchaeologist working on chop marks in butchering practices in southern Levant during the Iron Age, which was, yeah, fascinating. I say it every time. I love these interviews. They're like tiny little seminars on very specific areas of history that usually I have maybe a passing familiarity with, but it's wonderful. I enjoy these very much. So our next guest was supposed to be here 15 minutes ago and unfortunately is not here and is not answering her email. So I am going to close out the stream and maybe try and fit her in tomorrow. But we will be back tomorrow at 12 noon EDT with the final interviews, more archaeology students, and Melina Seabrook, who was a HAPS recipient herself, wonderful archaeology student at Harvard, will be conducting the interviews. I will be hanging out in the background, relaying questions and running the stream. So thank you all so much for joining us. I hope you have an enjoyable rest of your day, and hopefully we will see you tomorrow.